For those of you who have seen the movie The Manchurian Candidate, you'll find this interview beyond intriguing. Dr. Nick Begich has spent the last decade investigating the use of 21st century technologies and their effects on our brain. It probably doesn't surprise you to know that technologies that produce this effect on people actually exist. Let's hear what Dr. Begich has to say about these well-cloaked technologies. As we've been talking about some of the 21st century technologies, one area that can't be ignored is that our brains are being affected by a lot of external forces, electromagnetic, radio frequencies, etc. Can you give us a little bit of background in the ways in which we're being impacted at this time?
Sure. You know, this area is we consider the most controversial area that we've covered in the last 11 years, and it's an area that I'm committing the next 5 years to educate the public around the world on, because I think it is the most important technology. The idea of interfering with the human brain, either from external sources without our consent, is a significant issue for me. In the United States, according to Secretary of Energy O'Leary, when she was in that position under the Clinton administration, she had said that over 500,000 Americans in a 40-year period had been victims of human experimentation in the United States without their consent. You know, from syphilis being given to black men in the southeast to see how they would die over time, to radioactive iodine and opiates in Alaska to see how they would die over time, and many, many other things. One of the most extraordinary reports came out in the early 70s during a number of congressional hearings, and there was actually a presidential report issued in June of 1975, and it was on CIA abuses within the United States, and it was a report to the president. What was contained in that was a chapter talking about mind manipulation using chemical means and programs, MK Ultra and their associated programs run by the Central Intelligence Agency. And all of these things are referenced in our written work. We have hundreds and hundreds of reference sources. But when you look at what they were doing then, it was primarily chemical means. At least that's what made it into the literature. When you go back even further, if you go back to, say, the Korean era, you know, in that era we had servicemen returning from warfare, and they were exhibiting these very bizarre behaviors. These patriotic young guys were coming back and handing communist leaflets out on street corners, and this is where the term brainwashing was actually coined, was in that era. And so our government began to look, can we, you know, what did they do and can we do it too, became the equation. And so as you look all the way into the 50s and into the early 60s, these technologies were being explored. By the early 60s, we had captured a device. It was actually during the Vietnam era, and we captured a Russian device called the LIDA machine, L-I-D-A, which was actually looked at by a guy named Ross Addy, one of the leading researchers, again, for military. He looked at this, and it was used for putting military prisoners of war into trance-like states, using flickering lights and sound and electromagnetic field oscillations, so that you would get in a very relaxed state, in a state where they could extract intelligence much more efficiently from you. And that became a whole new review for military technologists in this country, thinking maybe we can use electromagnetic fields to manipulate what's going on in the brain. In 1969, there was a book published called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, and this was put together by Jose Delgado, and he had his doctorate in electrophysiology from the University of Madrid from 1950. He came over to Yale University in the mid-60s and began mapping the human brain, stimulating the human brain in primates and bulls and animals, all different kinds of animals, stimulating different parts of the brain to see what parts were responsible for what kinds of actions or cognitive functions and so on. So what he was doing in those days, in the 60s, was he was implanting microcircuits, and then, or not microcircuits, circuits, and stimulating them with RF, radio frequency energy. So one of the illustrations or photographs shows a charging bull coming at him, and he throws the switch and the bull stops right in front of him. Well, by the mid-80s, he figured out you didn't need any implanted technologies. All you needed to know was how to modulate the right frequency. And the energy density, the concentration of energy, was 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces. Very small energy in the RF range, radio frequency ranges. Now, compare that to what's around us right at the moment. At the moment, there's 200 million times more radio frequency and energy around us in any urban area than there is naturally produced by the Earth. So a huge amount, and out of all that background noise, what he found is by hitting a precise window frequency with very low energy concentrations, you would pick that signal out because it was coherent, not like nature all over the map. It was a coherent rhythmic signal in a very precise frequency. The brain would pick it out, and he could change behavior from lethargic to highly active, back and forth, like switching on and off a light switch.
Let me ask a question right here. Is that with a subject that was in, say, a short distance of whatever he was utilizing to affect this particular pulse, or is this at large? Could he do this on, say, larger groups?
You could do it on an individual basis or a very large basis. In fact, if you go back to the work of J.F. Gordon MacDonald, he was a geophysicist at UCLA, and he was a science advisor to Lyndon Johnson. He wrote a chapter in a book called Unless Peace Comes, and the chapter was called How to Wreck Your Environment. But within that chapter was a section that said, if we could ever learn how to electronically stroke the ionosphere, this layer that begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface that's electrically charged, if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke it, he said, to get it to send a signal back to the Earth, we could affect the behavior of people over huge geographic areas on a hemispheric basis. And it wouldn't affect everyone. It would affect 70 or 80% of the population is what they more or less figured. But this was a technology that didn't exist in 1969. In the early 70s, Zbigniew Brzezinski referenced J.F. Gordon's work and said, you know, this is a technology that will likely emerge. What has happened with a project that I wrote a book on some time ago, Angels Don't Play This Harp, about the HARP project. It was designed to do many things. As a side effect or a deliberate effect, this can happen. You know, I mean, the fact is they generate the right kind of signal in the right range to override brain function. And that you can kind of look at the brain in sort of this way in terms of predominant brain activity. 1 to 4 hertz or pulses or vibrations per second. This is where you are in your deepest states of sleep. The next range, approximately 4 to 7 hertz. This is the theta range, the theta range. This is where you are between awake and asleep, when you're consciously aware of your dreams. This is where little kids are between 3 and 6 years old, why they have trouble distinguishing reality from imagination, because of the way the brain works at that time. A little bit further up you have the alpha range, 7 to say 11, 12 hertz, in that range. This is where you are when you're in the zone, when you're doing your art, your reading, your research, when you're really focused. You know, that's where you want to be. And then above that is the beta ranges, where people should be when we're actively having this kind of a dialogue. And then high beta is where you are in your agitated states. If you think about affecting the brain by analogy, similarly to dialing a radio station. You know, when you dial through the radio station, most of the energy is just static. You're static between the stations. When you get on station, you get resonance, harmony between the transmitter and receiver, and you get a nice clear signal. The same is true in the human body and the human brain. Whether you look at it at an elemental level, the elements that compose the body, or you take it all the way up to the organs of the body, you can create modulations, oscillations that will override the brain's natural rhythms. The brain will entrain or lock onto that external signal and begin to mirror it.
By putting this coherent signal in.
Right, coherent, meaning rhythmic, not random.
Right.
And so it's not so much the amount of energy, it's the way the energy is manipulated. And so what they found in military applications, and there's dozens of source documents that we quote, they found that they could use these external fields for degrading or depleting the ability of an adversary to, say, wage war or confuse their thoughts enough to where they become...
And this was actually utilized.
Yeah, these technologies have been around. They've been tested over the years. The question becomes is where and when, and under what classifications. And as we looked at them, and we saw over almost 3 dozen U.S. patents showing the evolution of these technologies cited in our work, this is all material that is in the open literature. When you trace the history, you can go back to, say, the early 80s even, where they began to ask for what's called dosimetry handbooks, dosages of radio frequency necessary to override various parts of the body, whether it be the brain, the heart, the liver, the lungs. By '85, the United States Air Force contracted with the University of Utah and actually put together the radio frequency dosimetry handbook, which is a big, thick volume that lays it out so that you can target the heart, the liver, the lungs, or the brain, or any other organ of the body to debilitate an adversary, or to stop their heart and kill them, for that matter. Recently you've seen promoted, in fact it's been every year for 5 years, they announced it as if it were brand new, this Humvee with a dish on the back of it that's used for riot control purposes, and the story goes it'll create the heat sensation on the surface of the body of about 130 degrees, which it certainly will do if it's ranged correctly. If it's ranged for, say, a half a mile and someone walks 20 feet in front of it, they're going to have a much different experience than 130 degrees on the surface of the skin. But in civil societies, we gave up burning people at the stake a long time ago, and now we have a technological application that doesn't create the same stench of flames affecting tissue, but has the same dramatic torturing effect. And this is used for not just foreign adversaries. This was funded also for domestic riot control purposes. And what they didn't tell the public is, by changing the waveform, pulse rate, frequency, or any number of parameters, you can have a much, much different effect. You can affect the brain, the heart, the liver, the lungs. You can do many, many things with the very same device, driven by software and the push of a button. And it's a question of the intent of the operator. But you introduce a new piece of hardware, you have to have the story. And the story for the military is, it's just for heating. And I believe it's a lie, because the technology is there, and they would apply that technology, if not experimentally, as they're doing in the war fronts that we're engaged in today, to see what and how far they can go with these technologies.
These same technologies, might this go back even to, say, the days of Royal Rife, when he was using his, quote, energy technologies or frequency technologies to target a particular bacteria or organ in the body and help enhance the health of it? Is this a more sophisticated but potential or version of that, except with negative applications?
Absolutely. Energy medicine is where the hope lies. This is where the hope is to move from the chemical models to the electromagnetic models. When you think about that transition. Now you hear a little bit of movement because everybody talks about electrochemical models. It's underlying all of the chemistry. And if you look at how the biological sciences evolved, people that had really good training and talent in mathematics tend to go to the physics side of life. People that couldn't quite get the math but were very brilliant tended to move towards chemistry and the life sciences. And they kind of parted the waters there, which was a serious mistake, because all chemical activity has an underlying energetic on the physics level. You can do things here that then create changes in the chemistry. And this is where the disconnect that I think has been, if you look at the papers that have been published in the last 10 years, you see these things coming together as people understand that the underlying energetic exchanges have an impact on molecules and chemicals that then manifest themselves in health maladies. So consequently, if you think about how Westerners approach medicine, we kind of look from the outside in. You look at the physical body, we might do some blood tests, we might do some imaging, but we don't do much more than that. If you think about Eastern medicine, it starts from an energetic level and works outward. It takes a little longer. Things like acupuncture that are quite controversial in the past have been quantified. There's a device that we demonstrate that where you can actually locate the points by measuring skin resistance differentials on the surface of the skin. You find all the acupuncture points.
Well, even HMOs are now supporting payment of acupuncture in some of these.
Because it works.
Right.
And it works profoundly without the chemicals that can damage liver and kidneys and the rest of our physiology.
Was it a blurry line between experimenting on, you said, 500,000 people over the course of the last few decades, and who might have been involved in the military or something, feeling they had an empirical right because these were employees of sorts or groups that they felt they had an advantage over? Isn't it a fuzzy line to determining who else is going to be subject to it?
Oh, ultimately, when you start looking at all these technologies, who are the targets? The targets are obviously declared adversaries. But when you think about it, and again, going back to this kind of technology evolving, the temptation of political leaders is to get their views across, to get their issues pushed forward, not because they don't believe in them, quite the contrary. They believe vigorously in them. Would they use technology? I think so. Zbigniew Brzezinski thinks so, and he's said so. The fact is, when you think about the invasiveness of this technology, think about the basic values Americans hold in common. Think about the very First Amendment. Freedom of speech, assembly, religion are all predicated on one idea: freedom to think. The fact that we have technologies that can interfere with that today demands regulation as a fundamental to the American character.